Failure to feed. Failure to feed is a feeding phase stoppage where a cartridge starts up the feed path but enters the chamber at the wrong angle, leaving the slide short of full lock. The nose can ride high or dip low, and the case rim can lag under the extractor. So the return to battery phase is interrupted. Magazines account for a large share of these events: bent feed lips, follower burrs, or tired springs change how the round presents. Rough throats and ramps can add drag, and recoil springs that are too strong or too weak change timing enough to upset feed. Extractor tension that's off a hair can make the rim-to-hook handoff sticky. Ammunition matters. Overall length, ogive shape, and jacket finish affect how smoothly a round glides up a specific ramp. Some platforms are famously picky about certain hollow points. The diagnosis follows this simple sequence: clean and lube. Inspect the feed ramp and throat. Try a different magazine. Verify the recoil spring rate. Then test other ammo. A TriStar Koenig C100 example reproduced nose-up failures across two Metgar magazines, suggesting a gun-level variable rather than two coincidentally bad mags. There are a few things to note. Duplicating the stoppage with both magazines lowers the odds it's just the mag, and hammer-bearing friction in some CZ pattern compacts can add just enough resistance on the return stroke to surface a marginal feed geometry. Failure to fire. Failure to fire is an ignition phase fault. The trigger releases the striker or hammer. The firing pin moves forward, and the primer either doesn't ignite or does so only after a delay. Mechanically, the chain breaks at the moment of primer initiation, either from insufficient firing pin energy or from dimensional issues that let the case move under impact. Common mechanical contributors include weak or broken firing pin springs, debris in the firing pin channel, firing pin protrusion or fall that's below spec, and excess headspace that lets the case cushion the blow. Magazine or feed angle quirks can leave a round slightly out of battery and mimic ignition issues. Compact pistols with lightened striker systems have less margin against hard primers and coal-thick lubricants. Ammo variables drive much of the variance: primer hardness, seating depth, and brass length to shoulder datum influence reliable ignition. Hard cup primers can demand more energy than a given striker delivers. Old or oil-contaminated ammunition raises the odds of a dead click. Hand loads on the ragged edge invite inconsistency and should be treated with hangfire caution when something feels off. On a square range, the safe protocol treats a click as a possible hangfire for a brief interval before clearing. Preventive care is straightforward. Keep the firing pin channel clean and dry. Replace striker and firing pin springs on schedule, and verify headspace after parts changes. A useful tidbit from that world-recording primer brand and lot alongside misfire data often solves recurring mysteries without touching the rifle. Failure to extract stops the cycle at the moment the empty case should leave the chamber. The slide or bolt travels rearward, the extractor claw slips or lets go, and the case stays put. Root causes concentrate in three places: the extractor claw and spring, the chamber, and the case rim. A fouled or corroded claw recess can blunt the hook's purchase, a tired spring relaxes grip, and a rough or dirty chamber holds the case long enough for the hook to ride off. Damaged rims and bulged cases magnify the problem. Ammunition influences the friction budget. Soft rims tear, poor brass springs in place, and thin coatings or rough surface finishes change how freely a fired case releases. Clearing is more involved than a simple rack. The slide is locked to the rear if possible. The magazine is stripped sometimes with tools, and the action is cycled to dislodge the case. Preventive steps are routine. Clean the extractor channel. Keep the chamber free of carbon and corrosion, and replace extractor springs and claws on condition rather than waiting for total failure. Extractor design has matured from fragile early hooks to robust spring steel parts with better heat treatment. Yet the fundamentals remain. Some side notes for diagnosis. A magazine that refuses to drop on command is a strong tell that a double feed formed from a failed extraction, and the geometry of the jam slide partially open with brass visible helps separate extraction failure from a simple ejection glitch. Double feed. A double feed is a feed path pileup. Two cartridges attempt to occupy the same space near the chamber, usually because a spent case failed to leave before the next round arrived. Mechanically, it begins with imperfect extraction or late ejection. The next round rises on schedule while the chamber still holds the fired case, and the return stroke drives the two into a mechanical standoff. Weak or damaged extractors, bent or low-tension magazine feed lips, sluggish followers, and fouled chambers all contribute. Ammunition is part of the equation. Out-of-spec overall length can wedge a live round where the feed ramp narrows. Damaged or bulged cases don't seat cleanly and make extraction erratic. Inconsistent pressure curves short-stroke the slide so extraction doesn't complete before the next feed. Clearing follows a well-practiced sequence. Lock the action if possible. Remove the magazine to stop further feeding. Rack the slide forcefully to clear the chamber and port. Inspect, and then chamber from a known good magazine. Prevention is mundane and effective. Rotate magazines, discard those with deformed lips. Keep extractor and ejector parts clean, and replace recoil springs before they age into timing problems. Two things worth knowing. A stuck magazine during a stoppage is often a hallmark of a true double feed, rather than a simple misfeed. And some platforms that allow topping off can create unique double feed modes if the follower is mishandled. Stovepipe. Chuck. Failure to eject. A stovepipe is an ejection phase failure where the spent case leaves the chamber but doesn't clear the port. The underlying issue is timing. Extraction happens, but ejection impulse or slide travel is insufficient. The common contributors are familiar, underpowered, or inconsistent ammunition, a grip that allows the frame to absorb too much recoil impulse, worn extractor or ejector geometry, and dry or fouled slide rails that bleed velocity. Pistols that are tuned closely to a specific load are more sensitive to these margins, and small differences in slide mass and recoil spring rate can make the difference between a clean kick and a stuck case. Ammunition choice shows up strongly. Light hand loads that hover below the pressure needed to drive full slide travel are frequent culprits, while quality factory loads with adequate headroom tend to eject more consistently. Clearing is straightforward. Seat the magazine if needed, and cycle the slide sharply while allowing the case to fall free, if lodged. Tilting the ejection port and sweeping can help before locking open and stripping the magazine. Preventive steps include keeping extractor and ejector faces sharp and clean, replacing recoil springs on an interval, and choosing ammunition with enough power margin for the platform. Failure to return to battery. Failure to return to battery occurs when the slide or bolt stops just short of full lock after a round has begun to chamber. Lugs don't engage, the breech face isn't home, and the pistol cannot fire by design. Root causes are distributed across the chamber, the round, and the recoil system. Carbon or dried lubricant in the chamber or on locking lugs adds enough drag to stall the last millimeters. Ammunition with excessive overall length, weak crimp, or swollen brass can hang at the throat. Weak or worn recoil springs struggle with heavy slides and tight lockup, while extractors that ride too hard on case rims can impede the last bit of chambering. Ammunition checks help. The plunk test, dropping around into a removed barrel to verify free seating, catches many offenders. Heavy slide variants and competition uppers magnify spring rate mistakes because the reciprocating mass is higher. Clearing favors safe, methodical steps. Unload. lock open, inspect the chamber and lugs, and test with a known good magazine and spring. Preventive care is routine chamber and lug cleaning, periodic recoil spring replacement by performance rather than round count alone, and case gauging suspect ammunition before it makes it to the line. An important thing to note is factory storage grease left in new pistols can masquerade as a spring problem. Also, a single tap that completes battery is diagnostic. It is not a fix if it becomes a pattern. The root cause is weighting. Squib load. A squib is an ammunition performance failure where the projectile lodges in the bore because there isn't enough propellant energy to drive it out. The primer often does ignite, so there is a report, usually a faint pop, and minimal recoil. The mechanical chain is simple and dangerous. A primer alone can push a bullet partway into the rifling. If the shooter cycles and fires another round, the following projectile collides with the obstruction. Pressure spikes dramatically, and the barrel or other components can rupture. Most documented squibs trace to reloading errors, including no powder or anemic charges. Ammunition discipline prevents nearly all of these events. Factory ammunition can suffer rare defects, but careful hand-loading practices powder verification, charge weighing, correct seating, and crimp. Reduce the risk to the background. Clearing is not a field speed exercise. The firearm is unloaded, and the bore is inspected physically. A brass or wooden rod can tap a lodged projectile out in some cases, but professional inspection is warranted if anything resists. Historically, the phenomenon has been present since the black powder era, and training literature leans on famous incidents to drive the point home. These include high-profile film set tragedies where a stuck projectile met a later blank. A couple of things to be aware of: a ringed bulge in a barrel can mark the point of a past squib, even if the gun continued to function. And some survival and training manuals teach counting shots and recoil impulses precisely to catch a squib in the moment. Hangfire. A hangfire is delayed ignition. The striker or hammer falls. Nothing happens for a beat, and then the cartridge fires, mechanically. The primer's output is marginal, or the propellant is reluctant to ignite, so there's a lag before pressure rises. The usual drivers are ammunition age and contamination. Primers deteriorate over time, and propellant exposed to moisture or oils becomes harder to start. In modern enclosed cartridges, the problem is rare but not gone, and environmental storage conditions are the clearest predictor. Protocol after a click favors caution. Maintain a safe muzzle and wait a short interval before opening the action. In defensive or competitive settings, doctrine may prioritize immediate cycling, but the underlying risk is the same. Opening the action just as a round ignites can send a case or blast out of containment. Prevention rests on storage and handling. Keep ammunition dry. Avoid letting lubricants migrate into cartridges, and cull suspect lots. Historically, the term wandered into general English precisely because hesitation was once so common. Today it survives as a training concept rather than a daily nuisance. Light primer strike. A light primer strike is an ignition failure marked by a shallow dimple on the primer. The firing pin or striker hits, but energy at the primer is below the threshold needed to initiate the mix. Mechanical causes concentrate around spring energy, travel, and debris. Firing pin springs weaken with use. Broken tips can wedge in channels, and accumulated carbon or congealed lubricant can damp striker speed. Striker-fired systems with short travel and lightened springs used for match triggers are more sensitive to hard-cut primers. Ammunition variables include primer hardness and seating depth. Seating too shallow or too deep can reduce reliability, and certain primer lines are designed for higher firing pin energy environments. The pragmatic diagnostic remains the same. Inspect the primer's dent, swap to a known reliable primer type, and test again before altering the firearm. Field handling mirrors, hangfire caution first. Then mechanical inspection. Cleaning the firing pin channel without greasing it. replacing springs on maintenance intervals, and verifying both firing pin protrusion and fall where applicable return most guns to service. Here are some observations from shop practice numbering magazines and logging. Which round in the stack misfired can isolate feed angle contributions that look like ignition faults, and a stuck fragment of a broken firing pin can create intermittent protrusion that's easy to miss without a detailed teardown. Catastrophic case or firearm failure. Kaboom? A kaboom is an in-battery overpressure event that exceeds the design strength of the chamber, barrel, or receiver. Pressure takes the path of least resistance and ruptures a case, peels a barrel, shears a threaded cap, or splits an upper failure mode depends on where the system is weakest. The most frequent chains involve a bore obstruction, a radically incorrect powder charge, or the wrong cartridge chambered and fired. A lodged bullet from a prior squib is the classic precursor. Propellant keeps burning, pressure spikes, and something gives. Wrong cartridge mishaps, such as .300 blackout jammed into a 5.56 bore, have been documented, and fatigued or overworked brass can add a weak link. Ammunition control and bore awareness prevent most of these events. Clear the bore after any anomalous report or impulse. Keep powders segregated and labeled. Weigh charges, and test loads conservatively. Designs try to fail in safer ways. Gas shields, safety lugs, and end cap choices distribute risk, but none of that replaces avoidance. If a catastrophic failure occurs, the priority is medical and scene safety, then preserving components for inspection. Quick shop floor notes grounded in field accounts. Multiple small mistakes typically stack before a kaboom rather than a single perfect part breaking alone. And over decades of shooting, many report only a handful of such incidents rare, but consequential enough to anchor modern proof standards and the constant refrain to stop and check when a shot feels wrong. And that's all for today. It's always rewarding to share this kind of material, especially with people who enjoy learning about firearms and their mechanics. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover in the future, please feel free to leave a note in the comments. Thanks for tuning in.